Imagine being told you have hours to live, not in a hospital bed surrounded by loved ones, but in a stone cell in 1970s Europe, knowing that, when the sun rises, you will be strapped into a chair while a man slowly turns a screw that will crush your throat. No quick bullet, no merciful drop through a trapdoor, just minutes of conscious terror as iron tightens around your neck. Your vision darkens, and the world slowly, agonizingly fades away. This was the garrote, Spain's execution method of choice, and it was used right up until 1974, making Spain the last country in Western Europe to abandon this medieval horror. What you're about to hear is not just the story of a device, but a journey into the darkest corners of state-sanctioned cruelty, where justice became indistinguishable from torture, and where dying could take longer than you ever thought possible. September 1974. Barcelona's Modelo prison sits heavy with dread in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside a sparse cell, a young man named Salvador Puig lies awake, counting down his final hours. He's 25 years old, an anarchist, convicted of killing a police officer during a shootout, though many will later question the fairness of his trial. But none of that matters now. What matters is what awaits him in just a few hours. Not the firing squad that soldiers might face, not the guillotine that France had used until recently, not even the gallows that still stood in some nations. No, Salvador will face the garrote, an execution method so deliberately slow, so consciously designed to prolong the moment between life and death, that it stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how societies can transform punishment into ritual suffering. The garrote. Even the word carries a sinister weight. It comes from the French garrote, meaning tourniquet or tightening stick. But this linguistic origin barely hints at the reality of the device. Picture a chair, solid and unmovable, behind it, a vertical post. Attached to that post, an iron collar that opens like a mechanical jaw, and controlling it all, a large screw mechanism that, when turned, slowly closes the collar around a human neck. The condemned would be seated, sometimes bound with additional ropes to prevent the desperate thrashing that instinct demands. A priest would offer final prayers, sometimes a crucifix to kiss. Then the executioner, standing behind where the victim cannot see him, would begin to turn the screw. What happened next is almost too terrible to fully comprehend. The collar would tighten gradually, methodically. First, it would compress the jugular veins, those vessels that carry blood away from the brain. Within seconds, pressure would build inside the skull. The victim's face would flush deep crimson, then purple. Eyes would bulge. There would be a sensation of the head expanding, ready to burst. And through all of this, consciousness remained. The victim knew everything that was happening. They could feel every rotation of that screw, every millimeter of tightening metal. Then the collar would compress deeper, blocking the carotid arteries, cutting off oxygen to the brain. Unconsciousness would follow, but not immediately. 10 to 15 seconds of that crushing pressure first, and even unconsciousness wasn't death. It was just the body's mercy, a temporary escape, while the executioner continued his work, crushing the windpipe, collapsing the structures of the throat, sometimes for minutes after the victim had gone limp. To understand how this horror became institutionalized in one of Europe's most historically rich nations, we must go back centuries. The garrote emerged in the Iberian Peninsula sometime during the late Middle Ages, evolving from simpler strangulation methods used since antiquity. The Romans had strangled important prisoners in the Tullianum, their underground execution chamber. But the Spanish refined it, mechanized it, turned it into something reproducible and official. By the 16th and 17th centuries, it had become Spain's preferred method for executing everyone from common criminals to nobles who had fallen from grace. It occupied a strange middle ground in the hierarchy of death. Hanging was considered shameful, reserved for the lowest criminals. Beheading by sword was honorable, quick, befitting nobility. The garrote sat between them, controlled enough to seem civilized, brutal enough to satisfy society's thirst for retribution. If stories like this fascinate you, If you want to journey deeper into history's darkest corners and understand the truths we retaught to forget, please subscribe. These stories matter. They remind us what humanity is capable of, and why we must never look away from the past, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. Public squares across Spain would fill with thousands whenever an execution was announced. Entire families would attend. Vendors would sell food and wine. Children would be lifted onto shoulders for a better view. This wasn't just justice. It was entertainment, spectacle, a carnival of death where the machinery of state power ground human life into a lesson about obedience and consequences. The condemned would be led to the chair, often having to walk through the jeering crowd, past the eager faces hungry for drama. And when that screw began to turn, when the struggle began, the crowd would fall silent, transfixed by the brutal choreography of strangulation unfolding before them. But what happened during Spain's darkest political era would transform the garrote from a tool of criminal injustice into something far more sinister. The Spanish Civil War tore the nation apart between 1936 and 1939. Brother against brother, ideology against ideology, a preview of the greater horrors that would consume Europe in the coming decade. When the dust settled, Francisco Franco emerged victorious, establishing a fascist dictatorship that would grip Spain for decades. And in Franco's Spain, the garrote found new purpose. It became an instrument of political terror, a weapon wielded against anyone who dared imagine a different Spain. Thousands were executed in the 1940s and 50s, their deaths often preceded by torture, show trials, and confessions extracted through brutality. But Franco's regime understood something cruel about symbolism. Executing political opponents by garrote rather than firing squad sent a message. The firing squad implied soldiers, combatants, people who had fought for their beliefs. The garrote meant criminals, shameful deaths, the erasure not just of life but of dignity. In 1940, 13 young women known as Las Tres Roses, the 13 Roses, were led to their deaths at Las Ventas prison in Madrid. They were members of the Unified Socialist Youth, aged between 18 and 29, accused of conspiring to assassinate Francoist officers. Their trial was a mockery, their sentences predetermined. One by one, they were seated in the garrote chair. One by one, the collar was placed around young necks. One by one, the screw was turned until life departed. Their crime wasn't violence, it was hope. Hope for a different Spain, a democratic Spain, a Spain where women could have political voices. They died for that hope, and their deaths became symbols of everything monstrous about Franco's regime. Decades later, after democracy returned, books would be written about them, films made, memorials erected. But in 1940, they simply vanished into unmarked graves, their families forbidden from mourning publicly, their names erased from official memory. As the decades passed and the 1960s brought waves of social change across the Western world, Spain remained frozen in authoritarian ice. While Britain abolished the death penalty in 1965, while France debated the ethics of the guillotine, while the United States grappled with its own use of execution, Spain continued garroting. Between 1961 and 1975, 49 people were executed this way. International human rights organizations protested. Foreign governments expressed concern. But Franco was unmoved. He saw the garrote as part of Spanish tradition, authentic national identity standing firm against foreign liberal corruption. To abandon it would be to surrender to modernity, to admit that Spain's traditional values were wrong. So the chair remained, the collar stayed polished. The executioner kept his position. Salvador Puig became a cause célèbre not because his case was unique, but because the world was finally watching. By 1974, the idea that a Western European nation was still crushing throats with medieval devices seemed almost incomprehensible. The execution date was set for March 2. Protests erupted across Europe. Amnesty International mobilized. Appeals for clemency poured in from governments, intellectuals, artists, ordinary citizens horrified by what was about to happen. Franco ignored them all, At 9:40 in the morning, Salvador was taken to the execution room. He was seated. The collar was placed. Witnesses later reported that the process took approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes of turning that screw. 3 minutes during which a 25-year-old man experienced the slowest form of death his society could legally inflict. At 9:43, doctors confirmed what everyone in that room already knew. Salvador Puig Andich was dead, but something else had died too? That execution, broadcast to the world through newspaper reports and testimonies, finally shattered whatever remained of international tolerance for Franco's Spain. On the same day, at another prison, another man was also garroted. Their names were the last two added to Spain's long, dark list. The following year, Franco died. The transition to democracy began under King Juan Carlos, and one of the very first reforms was the abolition of the death penalty. The 1978 Constitution formally prohibited capital punishment for civilian crimes. By 1995, even the technical exception for military crimes in wartime was eliminated. The garrotes were removed from prison execution chambers. Some were destroyed, physical evidence of shame eliminated. Others were preserved in museums, placed behind glass where they could no longer harm, only educate, where they could force each new generation to confront what their grandparents' generation had tolerated, participated in, or fought against. Today, you can see these devices in museums across Spain. The Barcelona History Museum preserves the garrote used in Modelo prison. You can stand before it, see the chair, the collar, the screw mechanism, and try to imagine the horror of sitting there, feeling that metal close around your neck. These artifacts serve a purpose beyond historical curiosity. They re-monuments to the capacity for cruelty that exists in all societies when unchecked power meets moral certainty. They're reminders that barbarism doesn't require ancient history or foreign lands. It can exist in 20th century Europe, in nations with rich cultural heritage, in societies that consider themselves civilized. The garrote persisted not because Spain was uniquely evil, but because authoritarianism always finds ways to justify its cruelties, to dress horror in the language of tradition and necessity. What stays with you most from this story? The victims who suffered, the society that watched, or the reminder of how easily cruelty becomes normal? Leave your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter. The Spain that executed Salvador Puig Andich no longer exists. Democratic Spain has faced its past with remarkable courage, though the work of memory continues. Organizations representing victims' families still search for unmarked graves, still fight for official recognition, still work to ensure these stories aren't forgotten. Because the ultimate lesson of the garrote isn't about a device. It's about what we're willing to do to each other when we convince ourselves it's justified. It's about how thin the line between justice and terror really is, and it's about why we must never stop asking ourselves, in our own time, in our own society, what cruelties are we accepting simply because they've become normal? What horrors will future generations look back on and wonder how we could have tolerated? The garrote is silent now, safely behind museum glass. But the questions it raises will echo as long as humans hold power over other humans' lives.